It was my first solo trip abroad. I had saved up for over a year, meticulously planned every detail, and read more travel blogs than I could count. My destination was Spain, a country I'd always dreamed of visiting for its culture, history, and, let's be honest, the food. Everything started smoothly. My flight landed in Madrid, and I navigated my way through the bustling city with the confidence of someone who thought they had it all figured out. My itinerary was packed, but I had given myself a few free days to explore. The trouble began on the third day. I was supposed to catch a train from Madrid to Seville, a route I'd booked in advance to ensure everything went smoothly. But my overconfidence got the better of me. I showed up at the wrong train station, a mistake that cost me my ticket, my schedule, and, for a brief moment, my sanity. By the time I realized my error, the train I was supposed to be on had already left. Panic set in. The next available train wasn't for another 4 hours, and it was fully booked. I had two options: wait until late evening or find another way to get to Seville. Not wanting to waste my day sitting in a station, I decided to take a bus instead. The attendant at the bus station assured me it was a straightforward journey, but as I would soon find out, straightforward meant something entirely different. The bus ride started off uneventful. I settled into my seat, staring out the window at the rolling countryside. About 2 hours in, the driver made an announcement in rapid Spanish. I barely caught a word of it, but soon enough, the bus pulled over in what seemed like the middle of nowhere. Everyone began disembarking. I hesitated, unsure if this was a scheduled stop or something else entirely. When I finally followed the crowd, I found myself in a small village, picturesque, but certainly not Seville. The driver gestured toward another bus, indicating that this was a transfer point. However, that second bus wasn't leaving for another 2 hours. Frustrated but determined not to let the delay ruin my day, I decided to explore the village. It was the kind of place you might see in a postcard: narrow cobblestone streets, whitewashed houses, and a plaza with a small fountain at its center. As I wandered, my frustration began to melt away. The slower pace of the village was a stark contrast to the bustling cities I had been in, and for the first time since my trip began, I felt like I was truly seeing Spain. Eventually, I stumbled upon a tiny cafe tucked into a corner of the plaza. The smell of freshly baked bread wafted through the air, drawing me in. Inside, an elderly man stood behind the counter, smiling warmly. "UN Cafe?" he asked, holding up a small cup. "Sí, por favor," I replied, grateful for my limited Spanish. As I sipped my coffee, an older woman joined the man behind the counter. She asked me where I was from, and we began a halting conversation in a mix of Spanish and English. When I mentioned my mishap with the train, she laughed and said something that roughly translated to, "Sometimes, the wrong road leads to the best places." The couple, whose names I learned were Miguel and Rosa, insisted I stay for lunch. They served me a meal of tortilla española, fresh bread, and olives from a tree that grew in their backyard. As we ate, they told me about the village's history, their family, and the festivals they celebrated every year. Miguel showed me a photo album filled with black and white pictures of the village in its earlier days, while Rosa taught me how to properly eat an olive without making a mess, a skill I didn't know I needed. What struck me most was their hospitality. They didn't know me, and yet they treated me like an old friend. When it was finally time for me to catch the next bus, I felt an unexpected pang of sadness. Miguel handed me a small bag filled with bread and fruit for the journey, and Rosa hugged me like we'd known each other for years. "Remember," she said in Spanish, "life is not about where you go, but the people you meet along the way." I eventually made it to Seville, but the memory of that village stayed with me long after I left Spain. I wrote about it in my journal that night, realizing how that one mistake had led me to an experience I never could have planned for. The rest of my trip went smoothly, but it was that unexpected detour that defined it. When I got back home, I told my friends and family about Seville, Madrid, and the Alhambra, but it was the story of Miguel and Rosa that brought the biggest smiles to their faces. Sometimes, the best moments in life aren't the ones you plan. They're the ones that happen when everything goes wrong, and you're forced to embrace the unexpected. Looking back, missing that train was the best mistake I ever made. Second story. I've always been someone who prides themselves on punctuality. My mornings are a carefully orchestrated routine, one I rarely deviate from. But one random Wednesday in May, everything fell apart, and that's how I found myself on the sidewalk, staring at my locked front door, cursing under my breath. The key wasn't in its usual spot on the hook, nor in my bag, nor in my coat pocket. A wave of panic set in as I realized I'd left it on the kitchen counter the night before. I was already running late for work, and the bus I normally took was about to leave. My phone buzzed in my pocket with a reminder of the meeting I was supposed to lead. I called my landlord, hoping against hope that he might have a spare. The call went straight to voicemail. Frustrated, I slumped onto the steps in front of my building. That's when a voice startled me. "You locked yourself out, didn't you?" I looked up to see an older man, perhaps in his late 60s, with a kind smile and a newspaper tucked under his arm. I'd seen him around the neighborhood before, always walking his small terrier. Today, the dog was absent. "Yeah," I admitted sheepishly. "Spare key anywhere?" he asked. "Nope," I replied, sighing. "Well, you're in luck. I've got a guy who's helped me a few times when I've been in the same pickle. He's a locksmith down the block. Want me to give him a call?" I hesitated. Something about accepting help from a stranger felt oddly vulnerable. But I had no other options, and the man seemed genuine. I nodded, and he pulled out his phone, dialing a number from memory. Within 15 minutes, the locksmith arrived. While he worked on my door, the older man lingered, chatting with me about the neighborhood, the weather, and his favorite books. I learned his name was Walter, and he'd lived in the building next to mine for over 3 decades. When the door finally clicked open, I felt a wave of relief. I thanked both Walter and the locksmith profusely. Walter just smiled and said, "Pay it forward, kid." I thought that was the end of it, just a kind neighbor helping me out. But Walter kept appearing in my life after that day. The next time I saw him was at the local park. I was on my lunch break, eating a sandwich on a bench, when he strolled by with his terrier, Maximum. He waved, and before I knew it, we were deep in conversation again. Walter had a way of making you feel like the most interesting person in the world. He'd ask questions that went beyond the surface level, like, "What's the most challenging thing you've done this week?" or "If you could relive one moment, what would it be?" Over the next few months, our paths crossed more and more frequently. Sometimes I'd run into him at the coffee shop, where he'd insist on buying me a latte. Other times, we'd bump into each other on my walk home, and he'd join me for a few blocks, regaling me with stories from his life. I learned he was a retired journalist who traveled extensively in his younger years. His stories were fascinating, covering protests in the 70s, interviewing musicians in the 80s, and writing features on social movements in the 90s. One evening, as we sat on a bench overlooking the river, he told me about the hardest story he ever had to write. It was about a friend who had passed away unexpectedly. Walter had been tasked with writing the obituary. He said it made him realize how fleeting life was and how important it is to make connections, no matter how small. "Everyone's got a story," he said. "The trick is to be curious enough to listen." That line stuck with me. Over time, Walter's presence began to change how I approached my own life. I started asking my colleagues deeper questions instead of sticking to small talk. I became more open to striking up conversations with strangers, like the barista at my coffee shop or the elderly woman who lived on the floor below me. The most significant moment came 6 months after I first locked myself out of my apartment. I was walking home one evening when I saw a young woman sitting on the curb, looking distraught. She was holding a flat bicycle tire and staring at her phone, which appeared to be dead. Normally, I might have walked by, assuming someone else would help. But Walter's words echoed in my head, "The trick is to be curious enough to listen." I stopped and asked if she needed help. She explained that she was new to the area and didn't know where the nearest bike repair shop was. Her phone had died while she was trying to look it up. I offered to walk her to the repair shop, which was a few blocks away. Along the way, she opened up about her struggles of moving to a new city and feeling out of place. By the time we reached the shop, she seemed more at ease. She thanked me profusely, and I left feeling oddly uplifted. When I told Walter about it later, he just smiled and said, "See? It's not so hard, is it?" Walter passed away a year later. I found out through a note left in the lobby of his building, inviting neighbors to a small memorial service. At the service, I was amazed to see how many people showed up. Dozens of neighbors, former colleagues, and even people he'd helped decades ago came to pay their respects. Each person had a story about Walter, a time he'd helped them, made them laugh, or simply listened when no one else would. I realized then that Walter had been quietly shaping the lives of everyone around him, one conversation at a time. Now, whenever I see someone who looks like they could use a hand, I think of Walter. His legacy lives on in the small acts of kindness he inspired, and I hope I can pass that on to others, just like he did for me. Third story. I always considered myself a pretty decent guy, helpful, trustworthy, and a believer in the idea that a small act of kindness could brighten someone's day. I guess that belief was what got me into trouble last summer, and why I've been so cautious ever since. It was a Saturday afternoon, and I was heading back to my apartment after spending the morning running errands. My tote bag was stuffed with groceries, and I was balancing a cup of iced coffee in one hand while trying to unlock my car with the other. That's when he approached me. The guy looked to be in his late 20s, just a couple of years older than me. He was tall, wiry, and sweating profusely despite the mild weather. He held a crumpled bus ticket in one hand and was waving his phone in the other. "Hey, man," he started, sounding breathless, "I hate to bother you, but I'm in a bit of a situation." I stopped fiddling with my keys and gave him a polite, albeit skeptical, nod. "What's up?" "I lost my wallet. I was on the bus heading to my mom's house, and I think it must have slipped out of my pocket. I've retraced my steps, called the transit office, everything. No luck. I've got no cash and no way to get where I need to go." He gestured to his phone. "My phone's almost dead, so I can't call anyone for help." "An Uber?" "Forget about it. I just need $20 to buy another ticket. I'll pay you back, I swear." Normally, I'm wary of situations like this. You hear stories all the time about scammers pulling similar stunts, and the logic of it doesn't always hold up. But there was something about the guy's demeanor, desperation mixed with genuine frustration, that made me want to help. "Okay," I said hesitantly, "there's an ATM around the corner. I can grab some cash for you." His face lit up. "Oh, thank you, man. You don't know how much this means to me." We walked to the ATM together. I withdrew $20, handed it to him, and he rattled off his phone number, saying he'd Venmo me the money as soon as he got his wallet back. "Thanks again," he said, giving me a quick handshake before rushing off toward the bus station. I felt pretty good about myself afterward, like I'd done my good deed for the day. But things didn't end there. The next day, I got a text from an unknown number. "Hey, it's Liam, the guy you helped yesterday. Can I ask for another favor?" Immediately, my suspicion flared up. Was this a scam after all? Against my better judgment, I responded, "What's going on?" Liam explained that he'd managed to get home, but his wallet was still missing, and his bank was giving him a hard time about replacing his cards. He needed a bit more help to tide him over until things got sorted. I was annoyed but also curious. Was this guy really in trouble, or was I being played? I decided to meet him in a public place to hear him out. We met at a coffee shop downtown. Liam looked even worse than before, disheveled, tired, and visibly stressed. He explained that he was between jobs, living paycheck to paycheck, and the wallet incident had thrown his already precarious situation into chaos. "I don't know who else to turn to," he admitted. I reluctantly handed him another $20, but I also told him this would be the last time. He thanked me profusely, and I left feeling a mix of pity and irritation. A week later, I got another text. This time, Liam wanted to meet for coffee, just to catch up. Against my better judgment, I agreed, curious to see where this would lead. Over the course of our meeting, I learned more about him. He had dropped out of college, struggled with substance abuse in the past, and was estranged from most of his family. He was trying to turn his life around, but kept hitting roadblocks. "I know I've leaned on you more than I should," he said, "but I'm trying to make things right. I've been applying for jobs, and I've got a lead on something promising." I couldn't help but feel a twinge of admiration for his resilience. Over the next few months, Liam and I developed an unlikely friendship. He never asked for money again, and true to his word, he eventually landed a steady job. But the experience left me questioning my initial assumptions about helping others. Was it worth the risk of being taken advantage of? Or was the reward of seeing someone genuinely turn their life around enough to justify the gamble? I don't have a clear answer. What I do know is that sometimes, doing the right thing is messy, complicated, and full of doubt. But every once in a while, it can also be worth it. And that's a lesson I won't forget anytime soon.